Sikkim 365 and Baylor Plus have teamed up to bring Baylor fans the ultimate content bundle. You can sign up now for $17.99 a month, a $5 monthly savings, and get instant access to all premium content on both websites. For more information, visit either sikkim365.com or baylorplus.com today. What's up, Baylor family? Welcome into Inside Baylor Sports, the official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. It's Friday, November 29th. Hope each of you had a great Thanksgiving. As we do every Friday, Grayson and I are going to provide you our offensive keys to Baylor's game against Kansas on Saturday, as well as give you our final score predictions for Baylor's final regular season game of the season. But first, here's our interview with Baylor offensive line coach Mason Miller. Coach, great having you on with us today. Obviously, great stretch here to end the season, five wins in a row. But I want to go back to the Texas Tech game after that off week. What was the biggest change for your group? Obviously, a lot can happen in an off week, and obviously it did. And what would you say the biggest factor, the biggest change in that week led to this end-of-the-year success for your group and obviously the offense?
Well, I think the number one thing is we finally settled on 5 guys. So there for a while, it was either musical chairs. We were still rotating people, trying to figure out, in game reps, who could do what. And then I think about midway through the BYU game, when Sydney goes in, you could kind of start feeling the thing ramping up, and then we go to Iowa State. Although we didn't run the ball very well that game, I thought that we did a very good job pass protecting. And then in light of that, we're throwing the ball all over the yard. We handing the ball off, even though it could have gone some yardage, probably wasn't the best idea because Sawyer was on fire, right? Yeah. So then we go in the off week and we add just one more piece to it, which was kind of the mid-zone type play that we put in. But I think the 2.5 weeks of the same 5 guys playing together, right? Sydney and Ryan and Colton and Omar and Campbell started playing together. And then once you start building that chemistry, my only regret is that, we didn't figure that out sooner. But I just think that was the piece of the pie that, we were always searching for.
When you look at kind of how Sydney has developed, because, you mentioned you wish you would have done it sooner, how has he really turned a corner since when he got to Baylor to where he's at now playing at this, really high level?
Yeah, so we tried to do it during fall camp, try to create some competition at left tackle, and he was playing left guard too. So really what he was creating was competition at the left guard, left tackle spot. And for learning a new offense and then learning how we do things and all that stuff, right? Trying to move him back and forth was just like system overload, right? So I thought, well, let's just because Caden Siraki is doing an incredible job being a swing tackle. All right, so dire straits, Caden's doing a great job. We can just move. I don't like flipping people right and left, but Caden can do it. So I was like, all right, we'll sit on that. Let Sydney play one position. And then when Campbell got hurt against Colorado and didn't play in the BYU game, and then, Alvin was going down his journey. We just made the switch there about midway through the game. And then the light bulb went off. So really that week of practice and how he's developed and how we kind of got him settled at one thing. And then he did a really good job of just being able to transition it out, I think has really helped. And then on the flip side of it, we've kind of moved Alvin back in. Having hands at the tackle position is a very, very, very important thing, right? And I've always felt like if you go inside and play guard, you got to put your hands on people a lot faster than you used to. And so then transitioning back out makes it a little bit easier, right? Did that with Liam Ryan years ago at Washington State. He ended up being a 36-game starter there, so. But Sydney himself has done a tremendous job. Super proud of him. Just a very focused young man. Wanted to, but, it just wasn't his time, and so we kind of went from there.
Yeah. So when you look back at that Houston game film after that 4-game stretch where it seems like you couldn't be stopped running the ball, I don't feel like you were shut down against Houston by any means. Like they had the bad snap, but there was a lot of 7, 8, 9-yard carries. There wasn't a long explosive carry, but
Correct.
What from that game can you take and say, and you mentioned it before we hopped on here recording, you said, I want to be the guy that's like, we're going to get whipped. Well, what can you take from that Houston game to motivate your guys to be better for this last game against Kansas?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think before we had the bad snap and all that drama, I think we were like at 126 yards rushing in the first half. Like that doesn't happen. Those guys are unbelievable at Houston on defense. I mean, I tip my hat to them. They do a great job. And I'll just be honest with you, the second half, they just played harder than we did. We weren't popping runs, like we weren't indenting the line. They just played harder, so there was a little complacency, like, oh, we're going to keep doing what we've been doing, because don't you know that we're the mighty union of Baylor Bears football? We're the O-line, and we're just going to roll our – no, that's not how it works. See, those guys are on scholarship too, and they're going to play hard. So I think that, well, you kind of got my gist of where I went with that motivation on that whole deal. So, and to the kids' credit, I mean, they do a tremendous job, and they work very hard, and I'm very proud of all of them. But, that kind of chapped me a little bit. And I'm sure it chapped them. Well, I'm not sure. I know. They were disappointed in themselves.
So, Coach, when you got to Baylor, obviously you're going, these guys were going from that wide zone scheme to a completely new scheme. And, some guys fit different schemes better and things like that. What was kind of the biggest challenge for you when you first got to Baylor? And what was that first thing you felt like you had to address when you got the job?
Really just man slide principles and pass protection on a consistent basis. Like, I mean, I know they've done that before and they did all that, I'm not saying anything anyway, but the way we throw the football, there are some people on islands a lot. And so to learn that individual pass blocking skill, like to me, run blocking is about fundamentals and determination, right? If you can learn those, and I knew we could get there to do that, but pass blocking is about, feet, physicality and bending and hands. I mean, it's walking and chewing gum, right? I mean, after that first scrimmage, I was like, man, this ain't going to go well, But again, they kept working and they did a great job and they got a lot better. So I felt like the pass pro was the first thing that it jumped off the table at me. Because if we can't throw the ball, they can just load the box and we're done.
Yeah. So with that, you're playing the Kansas team this weekend that is one of the better teams in the Big 12 that getting after the passer. They obviously have struggles in different areas, but 2.5 sacks per game. The last 5 games, I think they're averaging 3 sacks per game. What do you think makes them, just seeing them on film, what makes them so effective? And is that just kind of their mindset? We're going to try to get after the passer and create havoc. Is it from the down linemen? Is it from the linebackers? What does that look like for your unit in this game?
I tell you what, they're just probably the most persistent group we've played. I mean, they are just determined individuals. They're persistent. You can tell they're well coached. They've got a chip on their shoulder, blue collar type mentality. We're coming with a lunch pail type deal. And so, we've got to step up our game. Not that anybody we haven't played before hasn't. I've always thought every week the person we were going to play was getting we were going to get their best from us. And they were going to give us their best. So, but we've got to definitely respect everyone, fear no one, but they're persistent. They play hard. All that. It's really impressive to watch.
So, Coach, I know we get to see the starters every week, and you've had a very cohesive unit now. For a while, but who are some of the young guys that are really, making a jump, through the course of the season and maybe in the off season as well?
I think we use the term young guy, right? And so here's where, and I have to explain this to them a little bit, right? Alvin and Caden Siraki are still young guys. They're sophomores. And I realize they're 6'5", 300 and whatever pounds. They're still puppies, right? And so they have had a tremendous growth here recently. Colton Siraki, Colton Thompson, really doing a great job. Like all those young guys that we have on a day-to-day basis that are really kind of working with us. And then, we'll send them down to the look team so they can get some reps against a quality opponent. And the reason for that is I always remember Elton Jenkins telling me, like when he was a young pup at Mississippi State, he had to go against Jordan Simmons or Jeffrey Simmons and Chris Jones every single day. Well, guess what? He got better, right? And now this guy's an all-pro. So send him down there, make him compete against Jackie and all those guys and Uncle Steve Linton and all that, right? Let them go against those guys. And then when they come to us, it's not that big a deal.
Yeah. So another guy that I wanted to ask about, and it was a transfer, but Campbell Barrington playing right tackle for his whole career. He had played in that wide zone scheme, but he's been really steady outside of the game where he had the head injury or whatever it was, where he had to miss some time. How has he taken to this group, and what has he meant to this team, to this offensive line, particularly in his experience and everything he's been through?
Well, Father Time, he's kind of special to me because I know he's been through a little bit, right? He's had multiple O-line coaches, and this is his last rodeo. He and Gap, this is their last rodeo, and it means something to him. And I think when young guys see older guys nearing that next step in their career and their path, whatever it may be, whether it's playing on Sundays or going to get a real job and doing something they love to do, a light bulb starts going off, and he's been very expressive about that to everybody. And then, he also has kind of like I call it dad humor. Like when he's kind of like the egger on in the room. Like he likes to like rile the kids up and then watch them all like go chaotic towards each other. Like he'll get Omar and Colton Price just like going at each other in like 30 seconds. And it's the most comical thing to see. On the flip side of that, when we're playing West Virginia, all seriousness, it's a tight ball game. We got a chance to walk away, do our thing. I mean, he rallied the troops, got after them. So this is what we're going to do. And we did it. So I think he's been very, 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 very important to the growth in this room and really buying into what we want to do. And that takes a certain level of maturity.
Coach, you brought in a transfer this offseason who I feel like has been talked about a lot just based on people we've talked to and heard from. Dave Aranda mentioned him this week, and that's Omar, just being a leader for your room. How important has he been, just adding him, from the transfer portal this offseason, getting him ingrained into, your scheme, but then just seeing him be a leader and helping take this group forward from a, maturity standpoint or just getting better standpoint?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing Omar brings to the table is his level of intensity. I mean, he's going all gas, no brakes, and to the point where I have to like, hey man, it's time to take a little bit off the top. And I like that. He's also the guy that I can get after, right? I can get after, and then he gets fired up, and then the whole thing explodes, right? Or he and I have this kind of relationship that I think is fun. Is, he knows when I'm getting mad and he can kind of sense it, right? He knows when things aren't going the right way and he can sense it. But the other thing you have to do as a coach, you have to walk away and you have to let them learn how to handle it. Keep them in the framework of the box. These are the rules. When they start getting close to the edges, you got to pull them back in, and I think he does a tremendous job of that. And just his, he's been a winner everywhere he's been, right? Katy, he won. Montana State, he won. He knows how to win and he knows what it takes, right? So sometimes you have to feed the beast and let him go.
Yeah, Coach, really appreciate your time. Obviously, great visit with you, and really fun to see your unit develop throughout this season. And good luck this weekend against Kansas, and good luck in the bowl game as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sick 'em.
All right, Grayson, great visit with Coach Miller. Obviously, the offensive line has had, without a doubt, been the most improved unit on the entire team to me. I don't know that it's even close. So really, really good insight there from Coach Miller and what he's done with that unit, and obviously looking to get another win. And that could be a big part of this game, that offensive line against Kansas. And with that, let's move into our keys to this game, then ultimately our predictions. And I'll get this started. I really feel like Baylor has a chance to be explosive in this game. You look at Kansas' defense, 42% of its defensive touchdowns allowed have come from outside the red zone, while Baylor's offense scores 51.3% of their touchdowns from outside of the red zone, which is number 3 in the Big 12. But truthfully, like that number from outside the red zone is 20. That's number 1 in the Big 12 by far. The next closest are at 15. That's Colorado and BYU. So, but then I don't know that explosive offense and scoring touchdowns is the way Baylor wins this game. I think they're going to have to possess the ball. So my first key is ultimately going to be have explosive plays, but also have the ability to grind out the clock when needed. If you get a lead, if you can get up by 2 scores, hypothetically, see if you can possess the ball for a little while and not let that Kansas offense get on the field.
Right. I think that's going to be important, and I'll talk about that when I get into my first key of the game. But I do want to hit on the thing you mentioned about explosive plays. And I think a lot of that is kind of defined when you go and look at the efficiency of both of these, Baylor's offense throwing the football versus Kansas's defense trying to stop the pass. And just to be clear, Kansas does have playmakers. They do have guys who are absolute dudes. They have some NFL guys in their secondary, but that doesn't mean that they don't give up big plays, because they do. And I think their safeties can be attacked, and it's been proven over and over again. And then you look at the Baylor side of things. When it comes to throwing the football, Baylor is third in the Big 12 in passing efficiency, only behind Colorado and TCU, two passing offenses that we know are extremely elite. I think we all can agree on that. They both have deficiencies in the run game, but I don't know that many people have looked at Baylor and taken the time to kind of be like, oh, wow, like they can really throw the football. I think people finally kind of started to notice that more in the West Virginia game, but it's been there. It's been there for some time now. It was even there early in the season when they were struggling. When you look at games against Colorado and Iowa State, Sora Robertson was still very efficient throwing the ball. And then you kind of look at the other side, and this is where things get really interesting. And to your point, Kansas is 12th in the Big 12 in pass efficiency defense. They're going to give up explosive plays. They're going to give up first downs. They're going to give up yards, and they're going to give up a decently high completion percentage. And to kind of put that in perspective, when you look at the bottom teams that Kansas is around in this metric, Baylor's played 3 of them. So Kansas is at 12, but then you see Oklahoma State, Texas Tech, and West Virginia are right there at 14, 15, and 16. That's who Kansas is around, and Baylor really took advantage in all 3 of those matchups. And so it makes a lot of sense that you go into this one thinking there's probably going to be explosive plays available if Baylor can hit them. And if Baylor takes advantage of certain at times, they should be able to take advantage of the secondary, even though, again, KU does have some pretty good playmakers out there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of focus has been on Baylor's running game, and rightfully so. The passing game, as you mentioned, existed before the running game got going. The issue was passing was really difficult for Baylor before they found the running game, and that made it even more impressive. There was no running game to speak of, but they're still throwing the ball at a pretty high clip. And truthfully, that started with Sawyer Robertson once he took over as a starting quarterback. That took off, and then it set up the run games. Jake Spavital's done a great job. You mentioned it. They have playmakers. Kansas is number 2 in the Big 12 with 11 interceptions during Big 12 play only. That's a lot of interceptions, but it also speaks to what they're doing when they're not intercepting the ball. If they weren't getting those interceptions, that efficiency number would be significantly worse. That might take them down to number 16 in the league if you don't basically lead the league in interceptions. So if Sawyer Robertson can avoid those, everything that happens in between the turnovers is still going pretty bad for Kansas. Maybe you watch the Colorado game. When Colorado had the ball, they were moving the ball up and down the field as expected. The issue is they weren't scoring enough and they didn't have the ball long enough. Baylor has to have the ball long enough. And, obviously the defense has to get the ball back to the offense. But when they have the ability to have the ball, they should have success as long as they're not turning it over, which obviously that's the case for everything. You can point to that as a key to the game for any single game is not turn the ball over, as we saw against Houston, a game that Baylor could have easily won by 24 points if they had not turned the football over. But they did, 7 points directly from it.
Right. And I mean, that's just how Kansas plays, right? I mean, they're 3rd in the league in sacks, and they're going to play a lot of single coverage because they trust Mello Dotson and Kobe Bryant in those situations. Yeah. And they're going to pay for it at times, but then they're also going to force turnovers at times. And so is Baylor's offensive line up for the challenge? Can sort of take care of the football and not revert back we saw against Houston? Definitely question marks. I'm going to try to solve that problem a little bit for Baylor, because when I look at the game, I agree the explosive plays are going to potentially be there. I think Sawyer's going to have opportunities in this game, but I think this game is going to be won or lost on the ground. It's pretty much happened for Kansas all year long. So if you look at kind of what's happened, for them over the course of the season, Kansas has allowed 148 rushing yards or more to 6 teams. West Virginia, TCU, BYU, UNLV, Kansas State, and Arizona State. They are 1-5 in those games. And that is even during this stretch, right? The Kansas State game was in the middle of the stretch that they're on. The Arizona State game was right at the beginning of this stretch that they're on. BYU was in the middle of this stretch. And BYU is the only game they won during this stretch, and was really because BYU gave them a special teams touchdown, essentially.
And they didn't score at the end of the first half. BYU had 2 opportunities to score, and they didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And then to dig deeper into it, so they're 1-5 in games when they've given up 148 rushing yards. Okay. They're 0-5 when they've allowed 4 yards per carry or more. BYU game, they averaged a little bit less than 4 yards. The other teams, they all averaged over 4 yards per carry, and Kansas lost every single one of those. That's really important. And that makes that stat extremely relevant. You know, if Baylor can be at over 4 yards per carry and they're running for 150 yards or more, they're going to give themselves a great shot to win this game, because pretty much every team that's been able to do that has had a lot of success against Kansas. And you look at the teams that did it against them. I mean, is anyone on the list of West Virginia, TCU, BYU, UNLV, Kansas State, Arizona State really stand out as being a far better rushing team than Baylor over this stretch? Maybe Arizona State because of Cam Scatterboom, maybe because DJ Giddens is an older guy at Kansas State. But I think in general, there's a path for Baylor to have a lot of success running the football. Now, on the other side, if they don't get to 148 yards, Kansas is 4-1 in those games, but it's been very drastic because in those 4-1 games, Kansas hasn't even allowed 100 yards rushing. So when teams have struggled to run the ball against Kansas or gotten behind in games against Kansas, they've really struggled to run the ball and struggled to stay in the game. And that's, I think, what makes that so important. Baylor has to run the football. Bryson Washington has to have a big game. Sora Robertson maybe has to play a role in the run game as well. But Baylor has to figure out a way to be efficient running the football and productive. They have to post production.
Yeah, this was exactly my number 2 point to this game. And I actually kind of stole it from you because you've done this a few times, but it was looking at what Kansas has done in particular areas when they won and lost, and this stood out. And my key was rush for 140 yards. So I didn't do the 148, but that is what it's a very distinct line in what they've done on the season. And they're a team that want to possess the ball. They want to take it away because their weakness is on their defensive side of the ball. So they want to take that opportunity for you to score the football away. That's what they did against Colorado. That's to a T how they want to play these games. And I think where it's very impressive against Colorado, because Colorado is a pretty good rushing defense. They create tackles for loss and create sacks. Kansas was able to do it. They leaned on Devin Neal in that game. He almost had 300 total yards if you look at pass receptions or receiving yards and rushing yards. And that was just very impressive. To build on everything that you're saying, if you go back to Baylor's in this season, in the Big 12, they're 5-3. The only time that they won a game without rushing for 140 yards, that was against Houston. The difference between rushing and 140 yards was the bad snap. If you don't have that bad snap, they're at 146 yards. It was negative 25 on that particular play. And then they lost at Colorado when they rushed for 166 yards, which truthfully, that number actually is more impressive the deeper you look into it, considering Baylor wasn't running the ball. Sawyer Robertson had a lot to do that, but they lost that game. Otherwise, they are 4-1 in games where they did not rush or where they rushed for at least 140 yards. And then in games against BYU and Iowa State where they rushed for less than 100, they're 1-2. And that includes the Houston game where they won that game by rushing less. So this particular number sets up on both sides. It sets up for Kansas to not win games if you get to this number, and it sets up for you to win games based on the entire season trend.
Right. And the Houston one is a little skewed because you had that negative 23-yard snap over someone's head. So really it did get to that 140 number technically. And I would say that if you watch that game, it was clear that they were more in that 140 range than 120. But yeah, that snap happened. And I just think in general, it's such a clear distinction because it allows Baylor to take care of the football. It allows Baylor to milk the clock a little bit. It allows them to wear on the Kansas defense. Like running the ball in this game is just, it's going to be very, very important. I did want to mention, I saw this stat earlier this week, and it speaks to how efficient Baylor's been, but also explosive. Baylor's in the top 10 in drives where they don't have a third down. Baylor's in the top 10 in the nation in that area, which I found really intriguing because that speaks to explosiveness. It speaks to how fast you're playing. And it's also something that's been crazy because I'd love to see if that number was just taken into account after the bye week. Because early in the year, I can't imagine they had that many drives where they, didn't face a third down at all. But it's been very key in this part of the run. And for them to be top 10 in that area speaks to explosiveness, speaks to how they've been efficient on offense, and also speaks to just kind of what they could do to Kansas, especially if they continue to run the football at the level they've been running since the bye week.
Yeah. And I think to build on the rushing game for this game, let The lights are flashing here for a second for some reason. The way that Baylor used Michael Trigg against Houston opens up a lot more than we've probably seen, because Kansas is already going to struggle against the pass, and they've shown that they can struggle against the run. Michael Trigg being utilized in the middle of the field the way that he was takes another ounce of game planning for Houston. I mean, for Kansas, after watching that Houston film, because of the way that he was used over the top of the linebackers and in front of the safeties, and truthfully, on a couple of occasions behind the safeties as well. Houston wants to play that physical style, and I think that was part of Baylor's game plan in that one. But for this next game, his explosive ability across the middle of the field as a tight end, knowing you probably are not going to cover him with a linebacker, so what do? You probably don't want to guard him with a safety because of his size, so what do? You're probably going to have to double team him. And not that you're going to completely game plan, because he's utilized so much in the run game as well. But if Baylor goes into personnel sets where Bryson Washington's in the backfield and Michael Trigg's out on a pass pattern, what does Kansas do to slow down Bryson Washington, who's number 2 in the Big 12 in yards per carry after contact? That's impressive. You've looked at guys over 75 carries on the season. He's basically getting over 4.5 yards per carry, or basically right at 4.5 yards per carry after he gets hit on the season. That sets up really well for Baylor in this game to extend drives against a Kansas defense that's not like Houston. He even did that against Houston. His number against Houston was really good as well. This isn't necessarily a key, but I wanted to point this out before we moved on. Kansas is 1-4 on the road this year. And then their wins are at home. Their only road win was at BYU, which we know how that game went. BYU probably should have won it. I don't know what the post-game win expectancy was in that one, but they controlled that game. And that's a game that Kansas only rushed for 73 yards. So I'm really curious to see if that's something that's just more about the way Kansas is playing versus the way they were earlier in the season, or if playing on the road is really an issue, because they had losses at Illinois, at West Virginia, at Arizona State, at Kansas State. And then their first win on the road this year was at BYU, which they've also been playing in a neutral site location the entire year at home. They're not even playing in their home stadium. But it's something to monitor in this game. You never know how the environment could change it, and not necessarily a crazy environment like after Thanksgiving. Baylor probably not going to have a crazy fan environment, but just being away from home and playing an early kickoff. Lance Leipold mentioned in his press conference this week that they're not staying in Temple this year. They're staying closer. They're staying in Waco, which I thought was really interesting because they felt like that hurt them a couple of years ago when they were there. So how fast does Kansas get started in this game, playing early game on the road? There's not a lot of 11 a.m. kickoffs in the Big 12 right now. So could be potentially an important factor in this game, is Kansas playing on the road versus Baylor at home.
I could definitely see that flipping things for them. But the thing for Kansas is they've been playing basically not home games all year, because they've been playing at Arrowhead, for most of this season. So I think that's also kind of hurt them, in the long run, just kind of in general with their start to the season. But yeah, I mean, playing on the road, Baylor's had a lot of success against Kansas at home as well. Yeah. I mean, we've gone through it a little bit, but I mean, Baylor has absolutely blown out Kansas pretty much every time they've played them. They really have never played around, even when Kansas was bad and you saw teams like Texas or Texas Tech taking losses to Kansas or playing close games against Kansas. It's like Baylor's always taking care of business against them. Yeah. Even 2022, a game that, I think Baylor only won by 12. They were up for pretty much the whole game. It never really was, too much in doubt. So I found that to be interesting. You brought up a great point, and this is actually my next key to this game. You mentioned Michael Trigg. I think Michael Trigg's part of this, and I think Ashton Hawkins is part of this, and I think Monterey Baldwin is part of this. I have a lot of confidence that Kansas's cornerbacks are really good. A whole lot of confidence in that. I have a whole lot of confidence that you shouldn't really be attacking them unless guys are just open or they're in zone coverage. I just do not think that there's a reason that you need to be doing that too often, especially when you look at how Kansas has guarded the middle of the field. There's 2 safeties and 3 of their linebackers combined have given up 13 touchdowns this year. and have really struggled in general in coverage in a lot of ways, and in a lot of games. And it's really cost Kansas at times when they've given up big production in the past game. A lot of it has been explosives to slot receivers, teams moving the chains with slot receivers. And I think that bodes really well for guys like Ashton Hawkins, Michael Trigg, and then potentially Monterey Baldwin if he can capitalize on a deep play or two. Yeah. I think it could really flip the game. And we've seen Sawyer grow a lot more comfortable throwing it across the middle of the field. I think early in the year, it was more about the rail shots down the sideline. And I think that has flipped in the second half of the year as teams try to take that away a little bit. It's forced him to have to throw it across the middle, and he's looked really good at doing it. He's going to have to do it again in this game. I think that's where Baylor holds the biggest edge in the passing game. So guys are going to have to get open. Guys are going to have to create some explosives in the slot. And seeing Michael Trigg emerge this past week, even more than he has all year, was a great sign. Ashton Hawkins hasn't been talked about enough. The guy has just been extremely consistent, which is what he was brought in for. I kind of feel like people have kind of forgotten about him a little bit because, Josh Cameron's played so well and Michael Trigg had this big game. But Ashton consistently, if you go through the year, he's just been the most consistent receiver on this team. He doesn't have a lot of 2 for 20-yard games or 1 for 15-yard games. He's pretty much been a go-to guy in this offense for moving the chains. And so I think it's going to be really important. I think that's the area Baylor can really attack them in the secondary. I mentioned this last week. There's no reason for Baylor to have to force the ball into coverage against Kansas's best players. I mean, literally Mello Dotson and Kobe Bryant. You look through this team, there's maybe Devin Neal and maybe Logan Brown, and those are pretty much the only two guys that I think you would say are better than those two. And so there's really not a reason to make them a huge factor in this game and take a bunch of chances. I'm not saying you don't throw the ball to Josh Cameron. I'm not saying you don't take a couple chances, but what I am saying is I think you have more of an advantage in the slot and more of an advantage to attack the middle of the field in zone coverage as well. So if you have Josh Cameron coming across the middle and they're in zone, obviously he's not being covered by one of those guys. Right. I just would frankly attack there very often, run the football, move the chains, and then if they start getting soft on the outside and you have some opportunities to take one-on-one shots, okay, go for it. But I wouldn't take too many.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, we saw it against Houston. They played it really well. Once on a receiver on the first interception, and the second on Bryson Washington, kind of sitting down and kind of sneaking a pass reception. And Jeremiah Wilson, I believe, I don't remember what his last name is, had a pick six. And it was, I think it was just a bad read. Both of those are bad reads by Sawyer, or he didn't see them. We haven't seen that from Sawyer, but it's one of those. It's not going to get any easier this week. So just be careful when you do take your shots. And I think you can get the ball to Josh Cameron on the screen game. I think that he's very efficient there, being able to get a few yards. And it's an extension of the run game, but we've seen him multiple occasions be able to break those plays for 40 or 50 yards and score. We saw that early in the season. We've seen it late in the season. So he has that ability to do it. In general, man, like across the middle of the field, and I don't want to put too much on the performance by Michael Trigg against against Houston, but that has to create another little bit of an ulcer for Kansas to see. Not only can he be kind of a safety net guy, but he can be a big play guy. That was 3 plays in that game where he's making plays after the catch. And then obviously the touchdown was impressive as well. So I'm curious if you get 2 guys crossing there, what predicament you can put the safeties in those. But yeah, I'm with you. The middle of the field should be open, and it should help the running game as well. That attention those guys can bring across the middle of the field can help Bryson Washington, especially if they're going to play man coverage on the outside. Him be able to get some long runs in this game, it has a high potential of happening as long as you can get to that second level. My number 3, because you took kind of my number 2 and I built on that one, but it's avoid timely penalties. I don't know how often this year we have seen this offense have a pretty steady drive going, more probably early in the season, but we saw it against Houston last week where they're driving down the field. They're about at the 50 going into opponent territory, and then they have a 10-yard holding penalty, and it sets them behind the change, and they can't recover. They can't do that in this game. They want to possess the ball, and obviously you want to score. You can't holding is such a judgment call, and did you see it or not, that you can't avoid them completely. But when you're having them at that area of the field, it takes you out of field goal range. It kills a drive that you had a, potentially 1st and 10 play, and now it's 2nd and 20. Those have to be avoided in this game. And if they can do that, it gives them more time of possession. And then obviously you have more potential. Kansas does not have a lot of penalties. They're number 5 in the Big 12, while Baylor's number 15 in penalties in Big 12 play. So that offset needs to balance out this game. There needs to be some balance for Baylor, and just be good. When you know that there's a big play, be smart. You can't avoid holding penalties all the time, but you can avoid unnecessary roughness, late hits, jumping off sides. That's coming that stuff's defense, but offense as well. Just be smart and don't hurt your offense when you have an opportunity to drive down the field.
Yeah, and we saw that a lot against Houston, to be honest. I mean, there were just times where it felt like they're moving the ball and then a holding call, and then you create an explosive play and then a false start. And those type of things definitely can cost you and can really change a game. And when you have a home game, you're kind of anticipating like, hey, maybe you get a couple calls that go your way, because frankly, the West Virginia game, they couldn't get a single call to go their way. It felt like for a lot of that game. So maybe that changes going into this. But I do think it's important, because when this offense doesn't have those little setbacks from penalties and negative plays, they're really, really good and really hard to stop. And I think your point on that kind of guides into my final key for this offense. And it's not allowing negative plays. It's something that Kansas does well. Kansas forces negative plays, and they do a really good job of it. They're top 50 in the country in tackles for loss. They're number 3 in the Big 12 in sacks this year. They get after you, and they want to put you behind the chains, and they're willing to take risks, right? They're willing to give up some bigger plays for the opportunity to put you in 2nd and 12. 3rd and 10. They're willing to do those type of things. And truthfully, we go through and look at the teams Baylor's played during this run. They haven't played a single team that has this much havoc creation ability. Not a single one has that blend of sacks and tackles for loss. We've seen a couple that decent at tackles for loss, can't get after the quarterback. We've seen a couple that, maybe get sacks, but don't get a lot of total tackles for loss. This team does both very well. And they're right there kind of in the Big 12. They're one of the best teams at it, for sure, in the nation. They're in a good position. They're in the top 3rd of the country in that area. It's something that Baylor has done a good job at avoiding, especially in this new offense and with their ability to pass block. Baylor's been awesome in that area, especially in Big 12 play. They haven't given up a ton of sacks. That's been key for them. And they haven't given up a ton of tackles for loss, which has been key. But you go into this one and those things can change. Those things can flip. And if they flip too drastically, Baylor could be in trouble, because then you start having 3 and outs. Then you start punting the ball back really quickly. Then you start allowing Kansas to eat time and wear on your defense. And those are things that can absolutely cause problems for Baylor in the results column of this game.
Yeah, no, it is. And it goes back to very similar about the penalties. Like, when you get behind the chains, it becomes much more difficult. When you're running downhill and you have a running back that can get you 4 yards after contact, that's where you need to live. You don't need to be if you're having negative plays. That means if it's avoiding running horizontal. We saw it a couple times with Dawson Pendergrass and Richard Reese in that game against Houston, where they went sideways, but then there was so much penetration they had to go backwards. You have to avoid that in this game, because they're going to try to do a good job of that. You mentioned it. Baylor does. They're number 1 in Big 12 play only in avoiding tackles for loss. A lot of that's because of Sawyer's legs. A lot of that's because of the pace that they play with, but they do a good job for it. Whereas Kansas, they do a good job defensively, and that's where they want to live. They're not going to be great defensively, but if they can get you behind the chains and then get you off the field, that's where that's where they feel like they're being successful on defense, in my mind. They do those things, and they're going to feel good about where their defense is for this game. I think it just all goes back to staying on the field. I mean, you're going to create explosive plays. Maybe you want your explosive plays to be from the 30 and you're scoring a touchdown where you've driven the ball a little bit. 80-yard plays are great too, but in the grand scheme of being able to stay on the field, keep Kansas' really good offense, potentially a top 10 FEI or efficiency offense in the country, keep them off the field. That's going to be a challenge. And I'm really excited for this game. I think it's maybe one of the more underrated games in the country this year, even though Kansas is 5-6 and Baylor 7-4. This should be a really fun game to watch. A lot of chess matches. And we haven't even mentioned that Jeff Grimes is the offensive coordinator, and Baylor fans are very familiar with him. The chess match between him and Dave Aranda should be really cool to watch. So, but we do need to move into predictions, and I will start us off this week. I know I normally pass that along to you. Yeah. So if you want to copy me, that's perfectly fine. I think that this is a game I really there's potential for both teams just to say, hey, let's grind it out. Let's run the football, but there's going to be explosive plays. Both of these teams struggle in that area at times. Who takes that away the most efficiently they're going to be in a good position. Whoever can run the ball, I say that you want to create them and take them away, right? But at the same time, you also want to possess the ball. So who can do a balance of both? And I think ultimately, and I'm going to agree with Bill Connolly on this, I think that Baylor does that. And I have Baylor winning 38-35 in an over game where there's more points than the 61 points. I really wanted to go under. I wanted that because I thought that both of these teams would run the ball. But at the end of the day, I think there's going to be explosive plays. And Baylor is good enough in the red zone when they get there against a good red zone defense in Kansas at home that they get to the 38, but they hold Kansas to 35. It's going to be a crazy game, but I think that's where it goes.
So I see what you did, Colt. You listened to the Bearcast yesterday, then took my prediction, and then you said,
I did not even hear your prediction. Yeah, no, I didn't even listen to your prediction. So there you go.
Yeah, I said 38-35 on the Bearcast yesterday. I'm going to go through this really quick, and I might change some things. We'll see. But how I kind of view this game is I think both teams are going to find success offensively. I've said it all week. I think this, if you're going to bet one side of this, it would be to take the over, which the over is currently sitting at 61.5. I think these two teams are going to score more than that. I think there's a chance it's played into the 70s, which is what you're kind of predicting with this. The 1.5 point spread in favor of Kansas. Again, I think that is more indicative of the talk all week nationally about this Kansas team, what they're going to accomplish, how they're fighting to make a bowl game, how they're the hottest team in the country. And I think that's people taking away from what Baylor has done, to be honest, and maybe not giving that enough attention. Baylor's a really good football team at this point in the year. Baylor's arguably a top 25 team. They're playing at that level. I think Kansas is playing at that level as well. So this is a great matchup, a game on the road for Kansas. It's in Waco, an opportunity in front of the home fans, an opportunity on senior night for Baylor to finish this thing strong. And I think they just hold enough advantages offensively to get it done, especially at home. I think they're going to be able to run the football. I think Sora Robertson's going to create explosives. I think the defense will get enough stops for Baylor to win this game. I initially picked Baylor 38-35 earlier this week. When I sat back and thought about it again, I actually felt like I gave Kansas one too many points. So I'm going to put it 38-34 going into this one. I'll take the Bears.
So you're letting them kick 2 field goals. They're scoring 4 touchdowns and 2 field goals instead of 5 touchdowns, right?
Yeah.
Good, man. Well, it's going to be fun.
A couple times. It'll be the difference in the game.
Well, that would be huge. I mean, we know Devin Neal had so many carries last week, and that's who they rely on so often in the red zone. Jalen Daniels probably is going to have use his legs a little bit more. They've used him more late in the season, but it should be fascinating, man. Like, it's going to be a great matchup. It should be a lot of fun. Best Kansas team to ever come to Waco, in my mind, even ahead of that team in 2022 that everyone thought was pretty good. I think this team is better. I mean, based on what they have offensively and the way they're playing right now. So it should be a lot of fun. But all right, Baylor family, that's going to do it for this episode of Inside Baylor Sports. Thanks to each of you for listening. As always, thanks to Coach Mason Miller for joining us in this episode. And have a great weekend. We'll talk to you on Monday. Sick and Bears.